Welcome to In the Open with Luke and Joe. I'm your host, Luke Schantz, and here's my co-host, Joe Sepi. And a big welcome to our special guest, Tost. Before we get to our show, don't forget to like and subscribe. In this episode of In the Open, we bring you a conversation with Tost, a distinguished engineer, the CTO for IBM Cloud Pak's architecture, and the host of the Hybrid Cloud Forecast Series podcast. We will be discussing his experiences podcasting about hybrid cloud, as well as his career path through development, consulting, and architecting. Before we welcome our guest, let's say hello to our co-host, Joe Sepi.
Hey, Luke. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well, Joe. How are you?
Good, good. Did you hear the sirens? You started talking even though I wasn't muted, so hopefully there were no sirens coming through while you were chatting.
I did not hear the sirens, but I hope everyone's all right.
Yeah, everyone's all right. How's the weather by you, my friend?
The weather is seasonably cold. It was warm the last month, and it is chilly. I'm wearing layers.
Yeah. It's similar for me. Obviously, we're as our listeners may know, we're not too far apart. It was nice, not bad, not long ago, but now it's chilly. But like I always say, I like my nice fall coats, so I'm excited about that part.
You keep saying that, Joe, but I have not seen you in a coat for 2 years.
So I don't know if I told you this story. I actually have one of the coats here. I was at a conference in San Francisco. This is one of my favorites.
That is a nice coat.
Nice penguin. I don't know if you can see that there. But look at this. Prepare to be blown away.
Oh, very nice.
Isn't that amazing? I left that coat in San Francisco at a conference at I don't even know where. I just realized I didn't have it. I messaged one of my colleagues, and he went to all the restaurants and bars and places that we went, and he actually found it for me. I love that guy.
True friend.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, without further ado, why don't we see what the weather's like in the Midwest? Let's check in with our guest, Tost.
Welcome.
Hello, Andre.
Yeah, hi there. So yeah, the weather. I'm in Minnesota, and usually people kind of make fun of me for the weather that we have here. And it seems like most people I get to talk to have this one story to tell how they came to Minneapolis in February and how it was, colder than the Arctic and so forth. It's actually not that bad, but it's all same here, kind of comparable to what you said. It's become seasonably chilly. We've had a few freezing nights, but overall, not too bad. I feel like we had summer until about a week ago. It was still in the 70s, which was a bit weird. And then we had our one day of fall, and now we're in winter, and that's how it often goes.
Yeah, one day of fall, and then boom, winter. You got to make sure your snowblower is all primed and ready to go. And yeah.
So maybe we could just kick off the conversation by, Andre, give you a brief self-introduction to our audience.
Yeah. So where to start? I don't want to make it too long. I've been with IBM for longer than I can remember, basically my whole career, over 30 years. It started in Germany. I'm actually from Germany, which then also explains my strange, weird accent that I have. Sometimes people ask me if I'm Swedish or Canadian or something, because they say something's weird with how you talk, but we can't quite place it. So I'm from Germany originally, started with IBM there. And then into a few years into that, I was asked if I wanted to go on an assignment to the US, and I said, hooray, let's do that. And I was thinking California or maybe New York or some cool place like that. And then they said, this is going to be in Rochester, Minnesota. And I had to look it up on a map. I had no idea where that even was. And I was thinking, okay, that's not quite what I had in mind, but so be it, right? So came here, was meant to be for 1 year, and that was in 1996. And guess what? I'm still here. It wasn't necessarily love at first sight, but it's become home now. My kids grew up here. All my friends are here. So I consider Minnesota home now. And work-wise, so been with IBM here in Rochester. Started out as a developer. The first language actually that I started writing code in was C++, and then went over to Java. I still feel like that was one of the coolest things I've done in my career, is when that this was here in Rochester when my boss at the time said, nobody really knows that you're here. So we can make you do things without having to tell anybody about this. So why don't you go and throw OS2 off your machine and install Windows, which was complete blasphemy at the time to do, and install this new thing that was called Java and see if we can start doing something with it. I think the JDK we used was called 0.8 at the time. And it was primarily used for, the bouncing hat thing in the browser, so to speak. And we started then looking at, can we use that as a serious programming model and language to do client-server programming, right? Have a shared server-side Java application that multiple clients connect to, and the things that you need to do around that. So we started to experiment, and it was lacking many, many features that were needed. But like I said, it was pretty cool. That then later kind of led into the whole J2EE thing. So this was way before then, and WebSphere and what have you, right? And I've basically been in WebSphere land ever since. Became a consultant for lab services at some point. I still feel like that was probably you might call the forming years of my career, so to speak. So in other words, going out there and helping customers use the software that they had just bought from IBM and do something with it. This first 90-day project or a pilot, or just kind of getting it up and rolling. So I did that for about 10 years or so. Traveled the whole globe, saw many countries. It was really cool to see, to be able to finish, even if it was short term, to finish a project and see our stuff actually being used for real things. So that was really cool. Then the travel kind of got to me, and I realized that my kids were gonna, go to college soon, and I had to make a change. And so I went back to development as an architect, and so that's what I've done now for a number of years. And then the last few years, in terms of what I do, I'm not writing Java code anymore. I'm basically helping with containerizing our entire software portfolio, and I guess that's something we can talk about a little more and dive deeper into this. The product offerings that we have there are called Cloud Paks, and so that's what you see in my job title. But that's basically the offering where we make all of our software stuff work in containers, let them run in containers, and plug them into Kubernetes and specifically Red Hat OpenShift. So that's what I do for a living right now.
Cool. There's a lot to dig in there. As usual, we have great guests. I'm curious though. I work on the Open Tech team, and our IBM's involvement in Java is, I think, long and storied. I'm curious if you could sum up that in terms of what IBM's done for Java and with Java in like an elevator pitch. I'm just curious what you were able to encapsulate that for a moment.
I feel like, overall, like I said, I feel like I was there from day one, right, when this whole thing started. And it's always worked really well for us. And so at some point, there was kind of a big milestone where we basically said, we're going all in on this thing. We're going all in on writing things in Java, following the J2EE programming model. And like I said, that then later went to WebSphere, which has been the platform on which the world runs their mission critical apps. I think to this day, right, tens of thousands of customers, and we're not the only ones obviously providing, offering Java-based application servers and so forth, right? And at some point that then went, since we're all in, and it often goes that way, then we obviously want to influence where it goes, right? And then that can only work with active contribution. And that's true for a lot of the open source stuff too, right? We're now running into this all the time with Red Hat, for example. Another topic we may want to dig into. Red Hat is doing everything in open source, right? And so we're now using their software, and we're going back to them and say, we have requirements. We want you to add the following function to your software. And they're saying, why don't you just join the party and do it yourself, as part of the community?
Yeah.
And I feel like in Java, we kind of did that, right? And we went all in, and we had a whole Java, I don't know what it was called, Java Technology Center. Started working on compilers and things like that. So I feel like we've been a very dominant force in that world. And I believe Java still is to this day the world's most used programming language. It's gone a bit like, and I think cloud computing brought that with it, and this whole idea of microservices and so on, and running in clouds, that now if you're building more autonomous components that kind of interact with each other through well-defined interfaces, it becomes less important that they're all written in the same language, right? So that's where people can now go and say, you know what, this thing, I'm going to write that in Node because it's much easier for me to do. And you can still plug everything together. That didn't always used to be the case, right? So I feel like that has just opened up opportunities for things written in other languages still.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
I'm hearing an echo from you, Joe.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. Oh, there, maybe it's gone. Cool. We could spend a whole, multiple episodes on Java and IBM and all that's kind of come out of that. But we won't. Not at least not today. Let's dig into other stuff here.
Well, I'd like to ask about the Hybrid Cloud Forecast Series podcast.
Yep.
So I will, and actually I have the link here we can share with our listeners. I'll put it in the show notes as well. And I guess tell me what you want, but I guess if I had a question, it would be, what was the impetus to start this? Like, how did you get the idea to want to start podcasting?
Yeah. So first of all, the idea came from my manager at the time, Jerry Como. And he's well known. I don't know if you've had him on your show. Maybe you should have him. He started his own podcast, and it was called The Art of Automation, just to give that some credit here. And then he said to me, Andre, maybe you should run your own podcast, right? Wouldn't that be a good idea? And I had never thought of it. But then I was like, yeah, podcasts are kind of all the rage right now. My kids listen to podcasts all the time. So I was saying, this is an interesting challenge, because up until that point, whenever somebody said, can you come and talk to us about a certain topic, that always goes together with visualization. That always means I can draw a picture, a diagram, I can take a screenshot, right? I'm not very good at graphics, right? So my PowerPoint presentations usually just have bulleted lists of text, right? But you have a reference point. You can bring that up, and then people can look at that, and then you can kind of describe and explain what people see, and therefore it resonates with them. When you do a podcast, all of that goes away, right? Because people are just listening to it. So it reduces it to audio. And so I feel like that changes the way you need to explain things and express things, because that visual factor is missing from it. And I thought that was a really interesting challenge, something I hadn't done before. So I was thinking, okay, I can do that. And then hybrid cloud is obviously a big topic for us, right? IBM's the company of hybrid cloud, so to speak. So it went into, how do we now have a series where we explain what hybrid cloud means to us? And at first I was trying to structure it by saying, what are the various areas that I want to dive into? And then I'll find people that maybe I can talk to about those areas. And I was struggling with that. And then I felt like maybe I should turn this around and just make a list of people that I know that work in this space, and basically have a conversation with each one of them where they bring their particular perspective on the topic to the show, so to speak, right? And I always say, this is kind of like us sitting together for dinner, and we're talking about what you do for work. And so that's supposed to be kind of the virtual setting, if you will. And that has worked out really well. I go around and I have an excuse to talk to interesting people that have lots of things to share, and I have really good conversations. And I feel like even if this weren't a podcast, I'm learning so much from this, and it's just been great fun. So in that respect, I hope I can do it for quite a while longer. I've been living and this just happened by kind of random chances. When I compiled this list of people I wanted to talk to, I noticed that they're all IBM Fellows. And I don't know if the audience is familiar with that. IBM Fellows are basically IBM's legends, right? They're kind of the top cream elite of our technical population, and there's not very many of them. And so I felt like, okay, well, maybe I should start with just talking to IBM Fellows about their perspective on things, and that's kind of what I've been stuck with. It's not necessarily a rule that I can't break. At some point, I'm going to run out of fellows. Like I said, there's not that many of them. But for now, it's basically that's been the list.
Well, I encourage our listeners to check out this podcast. We'll put the link in the show notes, and soon we're going to have them cross-listed on the IBM Developer site, so you'll be able to find them all there. And just to back up what Andre said, I've had we've actually had a fellow or two on our podcast, and sometimes through our digital developer conferences, I have the opportunity to meet some fellows and talk with them about presentations they're doing. And, as Andre said, they're very impressive. I mean, they reached that level for a reason, and it's always a treat to get to spend some time with them and learn from them.
Funny story is that I think you put something out on Facebook that I saw that was an advertisement for this show. And in that advertisement, you're calling me an IBM Fellow. And so I had multiple people reach out to me now and saying, Andre, we didn't know you got promoted. Congratulations. And I was thinking, oh, if I only wish it were true,
I'm sorry if I did that. I may not have realized I did that. It might have been some late night work.
That's fine.
Foreshadowing. Let's say that.
Yeah, I don't know how the nomination process works, but
you've just been nominated.
I'll start slacking people right now.
Yeah. That's great. Well, exciting. So I'm curious, because I think some of these things can be defined differently. How would you define hybrid cloud? To the normal developer.
Yeah. That's a good point. And in fact, the way I do these recordings is that we don't script them, right? We just have a conversation and we kind of see where it takes us. And that's been working really well. But I always frame it with the first question I ask is, what's your definition of hybrid cloud? And give us the elevator speech. And it's interesting to get a set of answers, but I think there is a theme that has evolved from that in terms of what is it really is. It always starts out with location. It says hybrid cloud means I can run it in all kinds of places, right? I can run it in my own data center. I can run it in a public cloud provider. And that kind of defines what I mean by hybrid. But then it goes further into, well, not only does it does the software and the applications run in multiple places, I also have it all connected, right? It's all integrated, it's all connected to each other. There's a number of use cases that drive the need for running things across various places, so to speak, right? And sometimes the most common one is that, it's easier to scale in a public cloud, for example. I can add capacity and remove capacity in an automated fashion in a relatively easy way, but maybe the data that I'm operating with needs to stay local for whatever legal reasons or compliance reasons, right? So I immediately have the problem is, how can I connect these things together and how can I make that work? So that's the next step then to go into in terms of, what hybrid cloud means. And then it goes even into, it's also a style of not just developing applications, but the whole operational model. We get into DevOps and how do I automate this also? How do I now manage these environments in a consistent way using a common set of APIs and so forth? So I feel like we always arrive at the conclusion that it's all aspects of IT are really impacted by this notion of hybrid cloud that starts out with saying something runs in someone else's cloud, but then there's other pieces that kind of go with it. And that's basically then underpinning pretty much everything we do, right? In terms of the offerings that we have, the services that we offer, right? The things our consulting teams do and so forth, right? There's always this question of, well, it runs in multiple places. It's all kinds of different applications. How can I have a common and consistent view on it so that I can then go and automate the heck out of it and start applying things like DevOps or GitOps and stuff like that. What's helping there a lot is, and then obviously coming back to the world that I live in, is Kubernetes and containers. It gives you this abstraction layer, if you will. It basically says all the things that are out there, I have an abstraction that I can express in a piece of YAML of it. I have a resource that's associated with that I can treat as a piece of code that I can then now run through an API server that then deploys real things, in this case, containers and storage volumes and stuff like that. But I have an abstraction layer I can look at that I can treat as code. So there's this whole idea of infrastructure as code that I can now make work across all these different places and environments. And I have a common API that I can deal with. And that now makes it a lot easier for me to manage these environments, right? Because I have that common API. I feel like that approach is not new, right? I mean, we've had automations for a long, long time. And I still remember the wars we had between Chef and Puppet, for example. Which
yeah.
one's a better tool, right? And then Terraform came along, and that was kind of the new thing, the new kid on the block and so forth, right? They were all kind of using this idea of saying, I have an abstraction layer and I have a set of literally files that I use to express what I want my applications and the environments they run on to look like, and then I can run that through an API. Kubernetes in that respect is not much different. I think to me it comes closer to being a model that reflects everything, you know, all the way, the whole stack from the infrastructure all the way into my applications and services in a consistent form, and then having a runtime environment that can deal with it, that framework, if you will, that can make it secure and resilient and highly available and all those things that I need for a real enterprise, right? So I feel like it's the perfect model to run environments and applications in this notion of hybrid cloud in a consistent way, but also make it enterprise grade.
And you haven't used this term, but I feel like we're talking about this as well, and maybe there's just a lot of overlap. But the term multi-cloud too, right? I mean, that being, I guess, the concept of, you know, any cloud, and that's facilitated by these sort of containerized workloads.
Yeah, and I've heard these terms being defined in different ways, right? Where people say multi-cloud means portability. It means that I can take something and I can run it in this place, and then I could take it tomorrow and run it somewhere else, and it would do the same thing, right? Whereas hybrid cloud then is typically defined to sit on top of that and saying, not only am I doing multi-cloud, but now I'm starting to plug these things together, right? And have them run together, so to speak. So I don't necessarily know that we need to get hung up on words and definitions and so forth. I feel like in the real world, this is all happening, right? I mean, I talk to a lot of customers, a lot of big companies in the world, and they're all doing it. They're all living in many clouds. They're all saying, I have some stuff living here. For a while, I think it's almost like a pendulum that swings. You know, for a while it was, you know, we run everything in data centers and virtualized kind of environments. And then the pendulum swung and said, everything now needs to move to the cloud, right? This notion of lift and shift even, so that I can close down my data center and have someone else run it for me, and that will save me money. And I think, and then I'm going to leave my existing applications alone and let them kind of ride into the sunset, and my new applications will all be cloud native, and that's going to be really great. And then there was the realization that it doesn't work that way, because A, you're still spending the majority of your money on your existing applications because you're not going to replace them from one day to another. And then B, there are sometimes reasons for why they need to be where they are, right? Like I said, just legal and compliance reasons. And, you know, one thing that I've heard a lot, one argument is where someone said, we have 500 applications. We'd love to all move them to the cloud, but we've tried to decompose them into what services they depend on, what they need, and it became spaghetti. Everything depends on everything. So we don't know how to stage this. We don't know how to take a piece of an application and move that, but then leave everything else that depends on behind. We don't know how to do that, right? And so that's where immediately you get into this notion of, okay, I need to integrate, I need to plug things together. These multiple places would probably never go away. And there's, I mean, when it comes to public cloud providers, what many of the companies I talk to have is they have kind of a standard preferred one. They have some kind of enterprise agreement with any of the big cloud providers, but then they all go, yeah, except for that line of business, they run some things over here, right? And so next thing you know it, they're saying, yeah, if I count it all up, there's like at least 3 or 4 or 5 different places that I'm running things in, right? And so we go, well, there you go, right? You're living in not only a multi-cloud world, but also a hybrid cloud world. strictly sticking with multi-cloud is easier, right? Because like I said, that's a matter of portability maybe, or you can even do a lift and shift and things like that, right? The ability to switch. There was an interesting discussions we had with some of the regulated industries or customers in regulated industries that would say, we need to prove that we're not depending on just one cloud provider, that if that cloud provider goes down, that we can switch to another one, right? So they were almost legally forced to work with more than one cloud provider, right? But that was, can we replicate the same environment in one place or the other? But then there's, like I said, there's additional scenarios where you say, my data lives over here, my logic lives over there, and then I want to take advantage of some AI stuff that lives in an entirely different place. Or I have things like bursting scenarios, right? Where I said I'm running it all on-prem except for Black Friday, which is when I need 3 times the capacity, and I'm bursting out into a cloud, right? That's also a hybrid scenario. So there's a number of use cases that drive all this, and you don't have to look very far in any given company to find them, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting. I keep thinking back to I'm imagining your consulting days, and especially at IBM, right? We're good at like compliance and working in finance and health and stuff like that. I imagine you bring a lot from that work consulting to the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, compliance is important. I think what makes compliance difficult is that often enough, the standards that we need to adhere to are specific by industry, and even more so specific by country often, right? So we want to do business with the US government, right? Okay, well, here's a set of standards you need to adhere to. You need to be compliant with them if you want to work in that space. Then we talk to a company in Europe and say, well, the European Union has a whole different set of standards that you now also need to be compliant with, right? So it becomes difficult. There's been a case where we were told, and this is a country I won't name, but they said, well, here's this standard that you need to be compliant with if you want to sell anything to the government there. And the standard basically said you need to hire a third-party company that is going to read every line of your source code and then basically come back with a report. That's difficult to do just even for practical reasons, right? And all kinds of legal questions and so forth, right? So I find compliance tricky. It's hard to do. There's many different standards to go with. There are some that are just kind of very basic, but there's many nuances, right? And then again, some of them industry specific. HIPAA, for example, comes up all the time, right? That's a healthcare standard, obviously very focused on privacy of data and the sensitivity of personal data and so forth, right? I feel like to be HIPAA compliant then covers a lot of ground in other areas as well, right? Because like I said, it goes into these kinds of things. I feel like I saw an article that was talking about GDPR. That was this European thing that came out, and I think it had his 5th birthday or something like that, or 5 years ago. That created a big piece of work for everyone to say, now we need to be GDPR compliant. And I think that also kind of triggered originally this thing that you now see in every website that you visit there. It says, I'm using cookies. Are you okay with that? Right. I think this goes back to GDPR that started all of that.
Yeah. So, what a mess.
That's amazing that's 5 years ago. Cause I remember when this happened, Joe and I were working in New York City, running a lot of events. And it really threw a monkey wrench into our entire operation of like, how do we take registrations for events? How do we communicate with our audience? What can we do with it? Where can we keep it? And it's amazing how it reverberated down to like, we're not even doing some kind of mission critical work, but it was obviously very important because the penalties are pretty severe.
Yeah. Almost the discussion reminded me a bit of the whole Y2K thing, right? And even though I'm actually that old that I was already a consultant in the year 2000. I was never involved with any of that work. So, and I guess the world didn't come to an end, so
yeah,
I'm lucky there.
Y2K actually got me into programming, but that's a whole nother story. So we've talked a bit about like kind of containerized applications and workloads and stuff, Kubernetes. You've even mentioned OpenShift. You're the CTO of IBM Cloud Pak Architecture. Take me from the idea of containerized applications, Kubernetes, to where the work that you're doing these days?
Sure. So where I always start is by looking at what are the dimensions that drive what we do, and it comes back to things I mentioned earlier. We look at the landscape that our IT solutions live in, and one is it's hybrid. It lives in all kinds of places, right? We need to support our software being run in all these places, right? The other element, and I alluded to it, is like applications old and new, right? We have old applications, we have new applications, we have refactored applications, we have modernized applications. It's like all these different application architectures and models. Our software needs to support all of them because they're all there. And so that kind of draws a map, if you will, that says we need to support all kinds of applications in all kinds of places, right? So that sets the stage for, okay, how are we going to do that? And then I think there's another driver that is strictly technology, and that was containers, right? To say, can we now run software in a better way by putting them into containers? And to me, that is almost like the third step in an evolution that we've seen, where we started out by running software on physical machines, on computers, right? At some point, these computers became so big that it was a waste to just use them for a single set of applications. So we said, we can carve them up. We can create a virtualization layer in there. We have this notion of virtual machines, and we run our software on those, and that makes more efficient use of the resources. I think this is now the third wave where we say, even the virtual machines have become too big, too slow, too hard to manage and maintain. We need to have smaller, lightweight things that can host our software, so to speak, and that's containers, right? So there's a certain new runtime model that comes with that, a packaging model that comes with that, is that you're basically delivering black boxes. You're delivering a container image and say, that's everything you need. Just hit the start button and run that thing, right? And you can start it up, within a few milliseconds, as opposed to 5 minutes or even an hour that you might need to start up a virtual machine. The need for that also being brought by, I would say, newer application architectures, microservices, where you say, I have a whole bunch of services that are all in themselves autonomous, but they all work together and interact with each other in support of a solution. I need to have a way to get these services up and running very quickly and scale them very quickly and create more of them, right? So it goes back to strict separation of logic and state, make them all stateless. So we need to have a really quick way to spin up, hundreds of them, as applications were starting to be written in that fashion. So again, I feel like the container runtime model fits that whole application architecture perfectly. So then we kind of made the decision that we believe, and I still believe that to be true, that the de facto way of running software is going to be in containers because of all of these advantages, right? Now, I remember very well, I had a conversation with a large insurance company years ago, where they basically said, well, our CIO decided that we're going to run 60% of everything we do in containers in the next 3 years. One of those big statements, right? This is the goal. And they said, we're containerizing everything. But then what they quickly stumbled over is there's no magic here. I keep saying a poorly architected application is still a poorly architected application if it runs in a container. That's not the silver bullet, right? What you need to surround that runtime model with a framework that allows you to do things at enterprise grade. And what I mean by that is it needs to be scalable. It needs to be highly available and resilient. It needs to be secure and compliant, and those kinds of things. Just saying I put something in a container doesn't do that for you, right? So then people invented frameworks to kind of fill that need. And there were multiple different alternatives, but I feel like the one that has won, if you will, is Kubernetes, right? That is now the de facto management and runtime framework for container-based workloads. And so we just kind of went along with that. And like I said, we make technology decisions, and sometimes they're wrong, and sometimes they're right. This one, I think, was the right decision, right? To say we're doing containers and we put them on Kubernetes. I still strongly believe that's where the world is going to go. It's not if, but when, and how quickly do we get there? Then the Red Hat acquisition came along, right? We acquired Red Hat. Guess what? They own the most popular, most mature, best accepted Kubernetes distribution in the market, namely OpenShift. We thought, oh, that's cool. They are now our siblings, so to speak, right? And so we can work with them as a primary landing place. And so what ended up happening is that we said, look at all of our software solutions. We'll put them in containers. We'll put them into OpenShift. And what that gives us is the ability to basically run them anywhere OpenShift runs. And guess what? OpenShift runs in all these places that we need to be in, right? So it kind of fit the bill perfectly. So in that respect, that's the journey that we started, I don't know, 4 years ago maybe, and we're still on it. And we're not quite done with it. And there's obviously the majority of real customer deployments still on non-containerized workloads, but that's changing. I see that changing, and so I'm confident that we're on the right path there. Now, specifically, Cloud Paks are more of a I always think of them as an assembly of multiple services that are related into a larger solution, so to speak. So that is, for example, all the things to do with automation, workflow, business automation, right? We have a Cloud Pak for that. There's a workflow in there. There's decision making in there. There's analysis in there of business events. So to say, we used to have all different separate products for that, right? And sometimes then there was the criticism that customers say, whenever I want to solve a single problem, I need to buy five things from IBM, right? So now we're saying there's a single solution that has all of these components inside with a consistent user experience across, so that you can then pick and choose what you need in support of whatever use case you're trying to implement there. So in that respect, I also often say they're a more coarse-grained view of our software offerings, right? It's just fewer pieces to look at. But then again, the underpinning that we're running this on OpenShift in containers. That's what Cloud Paks are. And so now there's pictures that if this weren't a podcast, we could show them, right? That basically say, what are the different categories of software that we have? You know, what are the service capabilities and service types that we offer with that? Cloud Paks are basically the vehicle to bring that out to the market and that our customers use to deploy these things. There's a related question to all that in saying, but what does the software do, right? I often kind of put that disclaimer when I get invited to do customer briefings, for example, and they say, tell them what a Cloud Pak is. And I'm talking all about the cool things we're doing around containerization and how we make it all highly available and how we make it secure and all the policies and that we apply and all that. And I'll admit that what gets lost in that equation sometimes is like, well, this software still needs to do useful things, right? The fact that it runs in a container is no value proposition in itself. It's a means to an end, right? So that's when we start talking about, okay, what are the areas that IBM works in? What is our software strategy anyway? What are the areas, the functional areas we want to focus on, right? And that gets into a discussion around, we said earlier, we want to be the company of hybrid cloud, but that's not quite the whole statement, right? What I hear our CEO say is IBM is a company of hybrid cloud and AI, right? So AI obviously is a big part of this. How can we're literally going around our entire portfolio and basically say, how can we apply AI to this capability to make it better, to make it smarter, so to speak, right? We're less thinking of AI as a thing in itself. It's more of a cross-cutting concern that you apply to everything you do, is to say, can I add some natural language processing to it, right? Can I add some machine learning to it? We can argue whether machine learning is really AI, but it's related in any way, right? And so this is also what all the teams are doing, besides trying to fight me off when I say, here, you need to do this thing for Kubernetes. They're saying, well, we also need to do functional enhancements around that. So AI is a big part of that. Automation is a big part of that. I use that word all the time. Obviously, data and security. I mean, and that basically sums it up. You know, someone said, what does IBM software do? And then I would say it's doing data, it's doing automation, it's doing security, and it's using AI across the board to implement this.
That's fascinating. And so from a in your role as CTO and architect, I'm imagining you're working with a whole lot of different types of teams that are developing these things, and you're coordinating. And could you give us a little insight into what it's like to create a consistent user interface across such a broad scope of offerings?
Yeah. It's incredibly difficult. It's fun, but it can also be very exhausting at times. I feel like we're in the middle of a bit of a revolution in IBM, and we still see how it goes. There's a school of thought that you need to give each team maximum freedom in making their own decisions and driving their own future, of course, right? And we've done that even organizationally. You know, we've established a model that is based on squads and guilds, and, you know, there's a whole terminology with that. The idea always being is that you have individual autonomous teams that can do whatever they need to do to be successful, right? And as a result, we have a fairly decentralized organization. The downside of that is that when you plug it all together, it doesn't look like it came from a single source anymore. And what we're seeing kind of as a shift, I think, also in the expectation that we find in the market, is to say we need for these things to be part of what you can think of as a common platform. We need for these things to be plugged into each other. They need to be integrated. They cannot all look and feel different. There's just a cost factor to it in terms of what it takes to operate all these pieces, right? If they're all operated in a different way, if you install a fix spec in a different way, if you stand up a solution for DR in a different way, right, that can get quite tedious. And so in that respect, we've centralized some of this function, and we've used this effort that I described of containerization and Kubernetification, if that were a word, to say, let's do this all the same way, and let's form some central function to do that. So one thing that I believe has served us really well is we've built a central database, if you will, of conventions and standards and just best practices that we follow as we're building these things. That has gone a long way. That has grown from very small to now very large. It's a large body of really good information. I sometimes feel like we should publish it because there's really no need to keep it a secret, so to speak. And so that basically presents, if you will, the guidebook, that where every developer that is engaged in these projects needs to have that as a reference and say, like, as you're developing this, here's how you need to do this. Here's how you make it available. Here's how you need to make it secure and those kinds of things. And then we even built a certification program, because then the next question was, what do we do if someone doesn't follow the rules, right? And our way of enforcing the rules is that we say they all need to go through a QA process where we're checking out that they're following all the rules, and we give them the stamp of approval. This is all internal, but I feel like, because we're talking about thousands of developers here, right, that all contribute to this. And I feel like this machinery, the central machinery we built up, was really essential to make it work. And so that's one thing. Then we formed, I mentioned the term guilds. You know, we're trying to always say, here's people that, yes, they live in different teams and they all are on their own kind of project, but they share a common interest. How do you do testing? How do you test on Kubernetes environments and OpenShift? How do you make sure it works in all these different places, right? Can we compare nodes? So we formed a test guild. There's representatives from all the different teams that are involved in testing are coming to that, and they're sharing information and best practices there, right? We have a documentation guild. We have a security guild. And so it's often when we say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could all kind of sing to the same tune here, we're thinking, let's form a guild. At least let's try to build a community around this, right? That then gets members and representatives from all places. And within this, we're trying to still maintain this sense of autonomy and decentralized decision making, because otherwise, I keep saying, it's always tempting, and this even maybe sometimes goes into real life. It's sometimes tempting to call for the dictator. You know, the one person that makes all the decisions and knows everything and is always right, you know. And I think we've seen various examples of the fact that doesn't really work in real life, you know. You need to have and I'm not saying democracy, I don't think that applies to the IT world, but a certain degree of autonomy and the right and freedom to make decisions. And so that is this balancing act that I'm in the middle of. And like I said, it's often fun. It's mostly fun. Not always, right? Because sometimes people start running away when they see me in the hallway. Now they can't run away anymore because everyone's sitting at home and they have to join my WebEx, right? But just that analogy.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, I think even on a smaller scale, like when you try to get a bunch of developers on a team together to decide, coding style, 2 spaces versus 4, all these little things, but you all want to get on the same page and just agree. And it's not necessarily a dictator, but you get consensus, and then you don't have to argue about that anymore. Like, this is the way we do it. But I wonder, we have a variety of cloud packs, right? And different sort of areas, data, AI, DevOps, maybe you can name some more for our listeners. But I imagine it's hard to kind of have the same architecture for all of them.
It is hard. I mean, it doesn't necessarily go as deep as saying, here's how you need to code it. Here's the coding standard that backs it up, right? We're mostly going into packaging, install, scaling, kind of how do you operationalize this, right? We do have, though, work on a common, we call that the platform experience, right? It's as simple as a common UI that everything plugs into and kind of a consistent way of how you interact with it. So you start a console and you recognize this is a cloud pack because it looks like one, and so forth. We're using an approach that we call design thinking in terms of how we develop products in IBM. And you're nodding, so you're obviously familiar with it. That basically said there's a big element of how we do development is that we start with the user experience. We don't start with, let's build a bunch of code and then we do the UI later. We're basically doing the reverse. We're basically saying, what's the desired experience that we want to establish? And then we see how we can implement that, right? And so to a large degree, what makes a cloud pack is bringing the design together, starting with that, follow the principles of design thinking, and then fan out into the different various applications. There's always a balancing act that, the teams will come to me and say, like I said earlier, you're telling me what I need to do to be a really cool cloud pack. But then I also need to make sure that I'm competitive within the particular market that I'm in, that I have a competitive offering for workflow automation, for example, or for data analytics and things like that, right? So there's always that balancing act of priorities, so to speak. But I think we've come a long way. And then again, one of the biggest value propositions of all of this is the common operational model that basically said the way you're starting and stopping the containers, the way you install them, the way you do upgrades. If that is the same across all these different offerings, that makes life for the ops teams a whole lot easier. Right?
Something that's really just striking me about what you're saying, Andre, and tell me what you think about this too, Joe, is we've covered a lot of these topics on our show. We've talked about DevOps, we've talked about design thinking, we've talked about what's happening with hybrid cloud. But what I love about your story is you've got like all of these pieces moving in action around what you're really doing. So it's not just like this kind of academic, let's tell you about it. It's so interesting that you're touching so many parts of what the organization's doing, and you're using all of these practices like all at once. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's what makes my job fun. I mean, we have this team that we call the Bring Up Lab that I'm leading, and we get to play. We get to play with all these things and make sure they actually work as designed, right? So the idea behind it is that we can identify problems before the customer sees them, but we're doing that by pretending that we're the customer, so to speak, right? So we're looking for real life scenarios. We're trying to build them out. We have all these environments, and the cool thing there is that we can, there's this idea of showing and not telling, right? And so I feel like we can show all of this. We have it all running in action, and I get to play with all kinds of technology, and that's obviously what makes my work fun.
What did you say that team was called?
It's called the Bring Up Lab.
Bring Up?
Yeah. there's a history to this. We had a bring up lab back in the WebSphere days, and it was kind of a similar story where, similar to now how it goes with OpenShift, that we have this application server, and then for a while people said, well, all of our software solutions should run on a common application server. They all need one. So they all started running on this application server. That made it very important that the way this app server was evolving into new versions and so forth didn't break anything. And so they did the same thing. There was a team that was formed actually here in Rochester, sitting in a basement. There was like 20 people sitting in a large room with no windows, and a fridge full of caffeine drinks, and just basically trying to break stuff, right? Making sure everything came together and kind of being working on code right before it would hit the customer, in this case, including the other teams, right, that were then going to use this. I think it doesn't exist anymore, but I think it was a very successful thing to do at the time. And so we because several of us have a history in WebSphere. So when we looked at this idea of Cloud Paks running on OpenShift and so forth, right? Also bringing all these different pieces together. Somebody said that to me. It's like, Andrew, you know what we need? We need a Cloud Pak bring up lab. So we said, well, let's do one, and so I was lucky enough that I get to run it. And so that's cool. I feel like, if ever I run out of things to do at IBM, I could probably become like an OpenShift administrator now. I've done it so many times that I feel like I got really good at it.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm curious, and we're kind of running out of time, but so a lot of what the Cloud Pak stuff does, I suspect that there are a lot of operators in there as well, which is something that we talk about a lot. Is that accurate?
That's right. And so that's another one of those things where we kind of made a decision. As in, when you look at Kubernetes and you want to bring workloads in there, you want to install something, right? What are the mechanisms that you use to do that? And in the early days, we used something called Helm charts, right? That's an orchestration engine for Kubernetes, open source, very popular. And so we started building all of our install scripts, if you will, in the form of these Helm charts. We got really good at it. And then we started looking, and this was also in collaboration with Red Hat, we looked at this new pattern that came out called operators, which basically meant that not only that we're going to establish a runtime controller element that would not only create the resources initially, in other words, doing the install, but also keep an eye on them and watch them, and being able to reconcile if things were drifting or if things were going out of whack, so to speak, right? That's something a Helm chart cannot do. A Helm chart is a bit of a fire and forget. You throw it out there, it installs itself, and then it runs, right? What an operator gives you is essentially, or the premise there is end-to-end lifecycle management, right? The initial creation of a resource, but then also being able to do, think of that as desired target state management, right? Having a declared desired target state and then being able to keep the target environment at that state. And you need to have a runtime element that sits in the environment, which is why the install, if you will, at the highest level of a Cloud Pak is always two steps. One is you bring the operator in the environment. You're basically creating that control element. And the second one is you deploy the actual workload, or the operand, as we often call it, right? So there's that two-step process, and then you can deploy the workload many times. The controller kind of keeps running, and so we've transitioned away from Helm charts into making all the installs in the management operator based. I still feel like we're just at the beginning of that journey. Ultimately, because again, the vision behind this is to have autonomous systems that can automatically correct problems when they occur, right? That has to be kind of, I think of this as kind of, it goes without saying, this is kind of the next wave of how we deal with software, is to make sure the software not only does what it's supposed to do, but that we have systems that can intelligently manage the software, right? So, and to me, operators are one pattern or one design mechanism and implementation mechanism to do exactly that. So we started out with, install, then you go with upgrade, then you have things like backup, restore, but then ultimately we want to get to a point where we do true autonomous lifecycle, end-to-end lifecycle management with these operators. So that's the vehicle that can get us there. And we're not there yet. And it's one of those things, like I said, when there's always this conflict of priorities, when I go to the teams and said, we need to make your operator better, and they go like, yes, but I also have these other things to do, and then we battle it out, so to speak.
Yeah.
But operators play a really, really big role in what we do in CloudPax.
And I wonder too, I find like the idea of AI and machine learning in like DevOps and CI/CD really fascinating. Like there's a lot that can be done there, I imagine. Does that also play into the work that you're doing there?
I don't think we've gotten there yet. I mean, I see the evolution as in, started out saying we do DevOps, right? It means I put out an application and then I can operate it by having a common tool chain that kind of drives it into the target environments. Then we started calling it DevSecOps, because we said not only do we need to do what I just talked about, well, we need to do that in a secure and compliant way. And there's other things in my tool chain I need to inject to make sure that that happens. Now we're talking a lot about GitOps. That basically means we're not only dealing with the application layer that way, we include the whole infrastructure layer underneath with it, right? So we're basically abstracting out, and like I said in the beginning, Kubernetes makes that really easy for us, right? Because I can now capture my entire environment, my topology, and the applications running on top in a bunch of files, essentially, right? And then have a tool chain that can roll it out. So that's where we're at right now. Now we need to start looking, and I think there's, some things that our research friends are doing, for example, is to look into how can I make that secure in an intelligent way? How can I inject, skills and things that will analyze things on the fly and then help me make the right decisions about what to do with a piece of code, for example, that's not compliant. So I think there's a lot of interesting work going on there, a lot of innovation going on there. I don't believe it's mainstream yet.
Yeah, it's fascinating though.
Something that came to mind when you were talking about operators, Andre, that I wanted to let our audience know is that there's a whole Red Hat marketplace of third-party operators. So if you are in this space and you're like, hey, I sell to enterprise, I want to be selling to enterprise with my software and my offering, I would look into that, because it's a great way. It's very difficult, as many folks, if you've tried to sell something to a large company, there's lots of hurdles to jump through. But if they're on OpenShift and you put the work in to get a certified operator in that marketplace, you've really taken away a lot of the friction to getting your offerings used.
That's right. I mean, it comes down to, like you said, like you've written a piece of really good software. How do people know about it, right? Where can they find it? What's the catalog that they will go to find it, right? And there's various ways of doing that. If you're targeting with your software, if you're targeting a Kubernetes environment, then an operator is really, for all the reasons I explained, I think an operator is a great way to do that. And then you can also use that to basically inject yourself into a marketplace like the Red Hat marketplace. That's where people can find your software, right? There's this notion of an operator hub. Every OpenShift cluster comes with it. All the certified operators are always in it. So everybody that installs an OpenShift cluster and goes to the console will have a little tile with your software in it, guaranteed, where they can go and try it out or, ultimately buy it from you.
Yeah, I think it's cool. I think it's like a little app store for your OpenShift, for your containerized.
That's right. And it's obviously meant to work in cases also where you don't have a sales force, right? Where you don't have, a high touch kind of sales activity. You just want people to discover your software and then make it really easy for them to consume it. And that's exactly what the marketplace does.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, we're out of time. This hour just flew by. It's been really fun talking, Andre. Is there anything we didn't ask that we should have, or is there any kind of closing thoughts you have?
There's only about 500 things you didn't ask, right? I can talk about this all day. No, I'm always happy to engage in discussion about kind of what's the future of all this. And like I said, to me, I feel like containers and Kubernetes is the future. It may not always be Kubernetes. Maybe there's going to be the follow on the next Kubernetes, right, that will emerge. But in general, having container-based runtimes and frameworks around that, pair that with, GitOps and DevSecOps and so forth, I think that's the direction that all of the IT world is moving into in a hybrid kind of fashion, right? So it's maybe my long-winded way of saying that I think we're on the right path here, with what we're doing with our software.
Yeah, I'd agree. And thinking about too, like the serverless stuff with Knative on Kubernetes and everything too, it's really, Kubernetes is a good
point. And yeah, we're out of time, but we could spend another 10 minutes on serverless, because I agree with you for certain use cases, right? That's going to become, but to me, that's not an alternative runtime model. That's basically sits on top of everything I said, to make now use the fact that I can provision these systems rapidly, right? And scale them up and down as needed to, and having them to be as stateless as possible. That then gets you into this whole serverless notion where I can have very, very temporary environments, so to speak. That's a trend that we go into anyway, and I keep telling the teams about, is that your software may die and go away and be recreated somewhere else at any given moment all the time, and that is not an exception. That's the rule, and you need to build your software accordingly.
Yeah, for sure. All right.
I'll just close out mentioning, please check out the Hybrid Cloud Forecast Series podcast. It's excellent. It will soon be listed on IBM Developer. And again, Andre, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure having you.
All right. Yeah. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you.